So what we'll do is field some of your questions, and then at the very end, Professor Pat Berger will have a few comments and a few questions, and then we'll close up the morning session. So let me...
Can we ask each other questions?
Of course. You can go first.
Well, I have a question for you, Bill. You talk about these long-standing continuities. Excellent. Is there any genetic work being done with the human genome to substantiate the long-term continuities among the population?
Not that I'm aware of yet, but Bill Honeychurch and others may have. Bill may have more ideas about that, and we have not. We have found a lot of human skeletal material and a lot of animal bone. The human materials have gone to the lab at the University of Mongolia, and that's the last we've heard of it. Unfortunately, there needs to be a lot of work done on these materials. It's a fabulous collection of skeletal materials going back a long time. So it would make the start of a really good study. But as far as I know, anybody else have any other ideas about human osteology and human analysis of human materials? Bill?
We just have, just recently, a new PhD on Mongolian ancient DNA done out of Indiana University. Gosh, I'm trying to remember his last name. Leland. I'll have to look it up. But he was looking mainly at large samples from central Mongolia, and his conclusion was that there was substantial genetic continuity for long periods of time in the samples that he was looking at. And he was looking at Neolithic all the way up into the Mongol period. So not a lot of evidence for dramatic changes or population influxes, but a lot of existing and continuing evidence for diversity already. So Western and Eastern gene pools being mixed from early times. That's what he's documenting. I'll have to look at his last name.
And there was like an article in Japanese journal recently too. I don't know if anyone saw that.
Yeah, please use the microphone. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's all I want to say basically is that I saw something in a Japanese journal, but yeah.
Do you know what data they were using?
I can send it to you. It's not my area of specialization. I was more interested in sort of the politics of sort of contemporary national geopolitical stuff is why I was looking at it, but I can send it to you, yeah.
Sorry, I know it's frustrating to wait for the mic, but this way the recording can hear it.
You had a climatologist analyzing the glacial history of the region where you were. Did he say anything about what's happening to the glaciers lately as related to global warming?
That's a good question. I believe he has. He hasn't told me. But I believe he has.
There is some work in the Tarim Basin that they've been doing on pluvial, non-pluvial kinds of things, so that there is quite a lot of interesting material from that area. There still is glaciation in the Altai. I have a feeling that this is mostly melting at this point. It's not whether there was a big advance in the Little Ice Age or not. I don't think we have any idea yet.
There is a Japanese team. There's been a Japanese team doing glacial work up on the Potemkin Glacier area, and they're finding radical retreat of glaciers, several hundred meters. And if you don't have to go to the technology, though, you can look at it. In the years that we worked there, the retreat was stunning, and the loss of rivers, the disappearance of rivers, was stunning. So I'd say that, and actually climatologists are saying generally, the Arctic areas of the world are being hit particularly hard. And the Talanbog and that whole related region are being hit very hard.
This is really obvious when you get up into that country because you see all the bare rock that doesn't have any lichen on it. in the summertime. So it's a very striking vision.
This is a question for Richard. Richard, in that fabulous display of rock art, I want to know if you found any of the tools that made the rock art, and was Serendakva able to identify those? And I guess that's it.
No, I wish we had.
Do you think they're there?
The rock tools may be there, but there are a gazillion, times a gazillion rocks all over that place. And I have looked at millions of them. Every time I'm out on foot, I'm looking at my feet and I'm picking up rocks and I'm hoping that I'm finding something. And of course, I'm disappointed until I find that biface or something that Serendakva gets all excited about, takes photographs of me and congratulates me for finding a new Paleolithic site in Mongolia. But those aren't tools that made the rock art. And especially any kind of metal tools in the Bronze or Iron Age. Punches, for example. We believe there's a hammerstone and then there's a punch. I think those are probably too valuable to leave around. Somebody careless may have, but we haven't been fortunate enough to find anything like that. And Esther, I don't, you haven't found it?
No.
Yeah. In fact, Bill didn't mention, I don't think, but in the Bronze Age mounds, we find almost nothing. Almost no artifacts whatsoever.
Couldn't we use the stone, just stone?
Yes.
In the deer stones,
But the kind of
sometimes
stuff you don't
the
find-
sometimes the deer stone sites have abraded rocks in them because there are different things that you do with the deer stone. You know, you have to punch out the individual designs and then peck out the interiors, making the edges, which is really key. And when you get into the later part or middle of the Erixer period, you get almost machine-made straight cuts in that go maybe a quarter inch or something like that. So this has to be made with metal tools. But then a lot of the finishing of these these deer stones is done with stones that are just round, hard quartz rocks, and you find them with abrasions at the bottoms of these sites.
So my question is also for Dr. Korum. It's about the dating technique for individual petroglyphs using this manganese, or do you have some estimate of uncertainty with it, and is there some kind of controversy over this in terms of how reliably, because it strikes me as an incredibly powerful tool to potentially move rock art from this sort of circular, using things like, at least from the perspective of horses, you say, oh, it's a stirrup, so we know it's this time period. It kind of seems to me like it could flip that entirely to the point of being this hugely valuable resource for understanding the chronology of some of these technological patterns, for example. But I was curious as to what issues are there surrounding the process of dating it, how wide are the uncertainty estimates, and if somebody disagreed vehemently with you about it, what are the kind of things that they would say or point out? Sorry, that's a big question.
No, those are great questions. And the answer is we don't know yet because this is so new. Tanjuo Liu, who's leading this study, has done some work with David Whitley in the American Southwest. And those are much more recent, maybe 1,000 years old and less. And those, evidently, they've got very reliable dates. And so far as I can see, haven't been questioned in the literature. He's also dated the rock buildup of rock varnish just on the surface rocks without petroglyphs to coincide with Aaron Putnam's dates. I mean, going back hundreds of thousands of years. And he's got dates that coincide independently. So it looks very good so far. We're going to retest this summer all the ones that we did 2 years ago to check, and then some new ones. But for example, the oldest ones we've got at the Lint, and this is where it become more controversial the older that they are, or that we say they are. The oldest dates we got in 2015 were 17,000 750 years, which puts it into the Paleolithic. But that corroborates Esther's assessments on the same kind of figures, exact same kind of figures, those ithyphallic figures. So, but what someone would say might question the kind of premises about the reliability of the correlation between the bands of manganese and the climatic data.
And so that, but it gets potentially less controversial for recent times.
I think so. Well, you can't be so far off.
One of the problems is that if you do have stuff going back to 20,000 years ago, where is the obvious Paleolithic art, you know, that we know so well from other areas? And it's just not there. So I've been kind of like a skeptic a little bit. I've been saying, yes, archaic is good, you know, under 10,000 years, that sounds fine to me. But, you know, if we're going to have another 10,000 years in the late Paleolithic, why don't we have some elephants and some other classic kind of creatures?
So if I could say something, I'm going to be really, really nasty now. First of all, I want to thank you, Richard. I think what you're doing is great. But why are archaeologists so unwilling to use their eyes and look at what they're seeing? And I'm talking about style, implements, the kinds of bows, the kinds of daggers, the kinds of clothing. All of these are ways of literally, well, actually relating figures, images together. And I think that it would be a terrific thing if there could be a greater integration of style and subject into these highly technical studies. We've talked about that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
The headgear.
Yeah, headgear, I mean, all kinds of things.
I have a question. I think someone talked about meaning of deer and the 4 different categories. But with similar meanings. So are they? Do you all agree with the person's analysis about the deer?
The deer stones?
No, the deer whether relate to soul or relate to death. Who was it?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, how applicable material from Tibet that dates to a much later period is to the Mongolian deer stone art. There do seem to be connections, but the question would be how intense and how pronounced are those kind of connections? And if they do really exist, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same customs and traditions. Clearly not. They're different peoples in many ways. I think my own hunch, and I've written about this, is that there's some underlying eschatological themes, some underlying themes about the nature of death and the afterlife that may have permeated very widely through Eurasian regions. And you know, going even if you look at it from a mythic point of view, this idea of common myths that are transferred very widely across the continent. So there could be some relevance, certainly. I just want to, does that answer your question? I hope as best as I could. Can I say, you know, I just want to mention something to you, Richard. I mean, anecdotally, when you look at the varnish, I mean, just with your eyes, sometimes it varies greatly on even one subject can have different degrees of varnish, and it seems that the localized geochemical processes can affect that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a great deal of developmental difference in the varnish, as you say, on the same panel, the same rock. I haven't seen it much in a petroglyph at great variety, but what Tanju does is he looks for the sort of deepest deposition in a little pocket, and samples from that. So yeah, that's why we have to redo it to get different samples from the same petroglyph.
Well, exciting. I wish you the best of luck.
Thanks.
Be useful for all of us, of course, all around the world. For that matter.
Given that we have to stop at 1, I wanted to offer Pat the opportunity to
Thanks,
say
Sonia.
a couple of things.
Thank you so much. This has been really eye-opening for someone like me who comes from the Chinese side of things, and who has long thought about archaeology, looking at it at first from a very ideological perspective as it was launched in post-liberation China after 1949, where there was a really strong desire to find the origins of Chinese civilization in the Yellow River, and to see everything as moving out from that. There was no ever any thought that there could be things that were developed elsewhere and brought into the center, not until much later. So that really puts this whole series of papers we've heard this morning into a really interesting light for me, because of the fact that I think what we've seen erode really significantly this morning are any sort of attempts to draw boundaries between places or cultures. That these, whatever boundaries there were, if there were ecological boundaries or barriers, they were really permeable. And that part of that has to do with the very nature of life in the regions to the north and west of China, that is a nomadic pastoralism by and large. So that things are always on the move. And it strikes me in Esther's work, and I've always thought about this, Esther, looking at petroglyphs, that everything that's depicted is something that's on the move. Nothing is an object that's stationary. There are no images of, it seems, of dwellings or other permanent or semi-permanent structures. Rather, everything is shown as on the move, but fixed, because fixed in stone. So what we've got left to look at are either petroglyphs that show us animals that were moving and are now fixed, or funerary or ritual structures where places are now given a kind of fixed meaning. So there's something really interesting about that. I think that also plays into the notion of how pastoralism might have abetted trade. And I'm not thinking just about trade in objects, although that's a major issue. We've seen glass moving and so on from great distances, textiles, for example, but also ideas, and what happens when ideas move and how they're adopted. And John, this is a point you made about Tibet, is that you're talking about a culture that may be very different from Mongolia, yet there are some material similarities, but I think what we're looking at is a kind of a process of constant translation as stuff moves. That it may have one meaning in one place, it may take on a slightly different meaning in another. So this is a kind of a fascinating notion to think about trade, and to think about even thinking about China and its relationship to these regions. Of course, China was the victor to large measure, so wrote the history, and that's why I think the only historical sources we've seen are coming from Chinese classical histories. But we do know now from Chinese archaeology, as it's broadened its view out of the Yellow River, this central region, and into Manchuria, where there's so many similarities with things that you were showing us just now, Bill. I mean, it really, very early as well. I'm thinking about the Hongshan culture and some of the Neolithic cultures that existed in the early years of the Shang dynasty. So there are really very sophisticated things happening. But the fact is that as we get into the, I guess we would call it the Iron Age, although we don't normally use that term when we're talking about China much. I was thinking about a site that dates to the Zhou dynasty. So from about the 7th century to about the 3rd century BCE, the site of Homa in Shanxi province, which actually was Xiongnu territory in the Han dynasty. It belonged to the southern Xiongnu tribes. And in fact, Kublai Khan was born in the region. It's a very interesting spot. But it was a bronze foundry that had a double business. It made sacrificial vessels for Chinese customers, and it made small metal applique for customers to the north and the west. So this trade was existing, and everyone was, it seemed as though the Chinese were willing to ventriloquize really other cultures in an interesting way. So we get this, I think, sense of the fluidity of things, and people who possess certain kind of technologies. And I just wanted to end on the notion of glass again, because I thought it was so interesting, Sanjo, what you said about how glass was staged as it came from the Roman Empire to the west coast of India. Then it moves up to sites in the Kushan Empire, and from there, obviously easily across what were not then called the Silk Roads, but what we call the Silk Roads now, across the north and south of the Tarim Basin and other ways to get to East Asia. Glass definitely came to China. There are lots of archaeological remains of glass beads in particular. I'm thinking about those mille fiori type, really complex glass technology. But the Chinese didn't really want glass for its own sake. They wanted it as frit, that is, to be ground down and used for ceramic glazes. So we see these things first being accepted and then transformed into something completely different, and actually transforming ceramic technology in China in very important ways as well. So what's great about, I think, what we saw today, and looking forward to this afternoon, is the way in which things move, the way that they bring ideas with them, or they leave ideas behind and come as empty vessels to a certain extent, where they can be completely reinterpreted in new cultural terms. So thanks to all of you. I just think this has been incredibly wonderful, and it really gives us a sense of how archaeology is becoming much more global in the way we think about it. And I'm looking forward to everything that's going to be said this afternoon as well. Thanks so much.
So please help me thank the speakers once again, and